Welcome back to Vision on TV here at the Climate Camp. We're interviewing two authors today. George Marshall, Carbon Detox, Your Step-by-Step Guide to Getting Real About Climate Change. And Uri Gordon, Anarchy Alive, Anti-Authoritarian Politics from Practice to Theory. So, George, can you tell us about your book, why you wrote it?
I think it's so important that we engage the general public about climate change. You know, Climate Camp is a subsector of a subsector of a subsector of people concerned about climate change. But most people find it really hard to even get their heads around it, to be honest. It feels so huge and daunting and other from people's day-to-day concerns. So really this is an attempt to write a self-help book on climate change, but also, to really get people to realise that the first step and the first challenge is actually believing in it. You can't do anything until you believe in the problem. It's a bit like, say, if you're writing a book on alcoholism, the first step for someone to deal with being an alcoholic is they have to realise they have a problem with being an alcoholic. The first step with dealing with climate change is to believe that there's a problem. And then the next thing is to realise that actually, in terms of how you respond to it, whether you respond to it in terms of your own lifestyle or political action, whatever that you do, that some things are more important and more useful than others. So there's a big tendency for people, for example, I hear all the time, to say, well, I recycle my plastic bags. And it's really a matter of saying, to those kinds of people, well, actually, that doesn't really count,
It's not enough, is it?
Well, it's not just it's not enough, but actually what you're doing is it's a distraction, it's a denial strategy to say, well, I do that little thing, but I could be doing so much more. Really, in a way, then, it's very different from camp, because my concern is actually how do you get people to make that step from non-belief to belief. Then, what they do with that information is then a very much more interesting process. My big concern is, though, that the vast majority of people haven't even made that step yet.
Okay, so Uri, what motivated you to write this book?
Well, I wanted to find a way to engage with all of the debates and discussions that have been going on in anarchist, like anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarian activist networks over the past decade, because since really the end of the 1990s, we have seen a massive growth of anarchist political activity, particularly in advanced capitalist countries, but around the world as well. And this growth has also been accompanied by really a redefinition of what anarchism is about, what it stands for. Because there is no major, massive thread linking contemporary anarchist movements with the historical early 20th century anarchist movements who were physically wiped out for the most part by both communist and fascist regimes in Europe, by the Red Scare in the US. So what happens today is that we're really looking at a new reconfiguration of these anarchist political cultures that are mainly about shared ways of doing politics, ways that are based on direct action, based on creating a new society within the shell of the old, on striving for autonomy and equality across society. And what I wanted to do is to see how we can create a theory that doesn't get formulated somewhere in an abstract way, but actually proceeds directly from the practice of the living movement and responds and engages to the debates that are happening inside that movement about things like leadership inside the movement, or the use of violence, or the place of technology, or the relationship to national liberation movements. So I'm trying to discuss these issues in ways that directly engage with how activists perceive them, with the questions they're asking.
But do you think anarchy is appropriate for the 21st century?
I think that in the 21st century, anarchy remains the last legitimate discourse of revolutionary opposition to capitalism, patriarchy, and all other forms and systems of domination that make life miserable for the majority of humanity. I think that after the fall of the Soviet Union and the thorough discreditation of attempts to change the world by taking power, it has now come the time for changing the world without taking power, which is what anarchism stands for.
So do you think the Climate Camp is an example of practical anarchy?
I think so very much. I think that since the beginning of this camp, and this camp is based on experiences of previous action camps, for example, during blockades of Group of 8 summits and so on, everything here is really being organized in a decentralized, horizontal way. There are no bosses, there are no managers. People get together to make decisions at the closest as possible level to where that decision is going to affect. And I think that you can see really how it is eminently possible to have a living example of anarchy in action, precisely in the way that we have a very well organized camp without anyone being the boss.
So George, what do you think about this?
I think the principles that camp has run on are completely fascinating and inspiring, and I really value it. However, I think there's a kind of a sad lost opportunity there, because the very qualities which make it so powerful, which is that it can really engage people and draw them in, that it can really allow participants to feel that they're part of the process and decision making, can become so tied up with an expressed political theory, an aggressively expressed political theory, that it can actually alienate and push away the very people who could gain the most from being here. It's a difficult balance, and we all feel this. But on the one hand, we want to be radical, we want to have a strong radical political vision, but at the same time, we also want to build a mass movement. And it's really, there's no disagreement. What we're doing is we're just trying to find a way of navigating that space. Personally, where I sit on it is that I would be in favour of following, so we say, anarchist principles in terms of self-organising without labelling them as such. I would like people to come and discover through experience and then go, yes, there's really something in this. But what worries me about the camp is that it wears its colours so prominently that people who could really learn from this and could really gain from it don't come. And I'm looking around here and I'm thinking there's an awful lot of people I know who are very actively involved with climate change issues and very concerned on it who aren't here. And I think that they're pushed away and rejected because of some of this kind of ideological purism.
I think it's a good point. There are a certain sort of there's a small smattering of different people who wouldn't normally be here, but it's not the majority. It's the usual suspects.
I really disagree with that. I've been spending the last few days in the camp, and I have been seeing a lot of not just unfamiliar faces, but people from backgrounds and persuasions that are much more diverse than explicitly anti-capitalist or anarchist opinions. And like George says, there is always a need to be, there is always a trade-off between having a very broad appeal and having very clear political principles. To me it seems that this camp is far from wearing any explicit political colors kind of prominently. I think that, we were in more than one workshop listening to proposals for very top-down, state-centered responses to the crisis that climate change and energy depletion and other converging crises of the 20th century pose to capitalism. And for me, this is actually a loss. I think that it's a question of a division of labor. Are we talking about what the broad environmental justice, climate movement should be about? In which case I agree that it should be very broad, very diverse. But if we're talking about this, about the climate camp itself, coming as it does from this tradition of anti-capitalist resistance, then I think it is totally worthwhile for there to be one space, one collective space, in which there is an expressly anti-capitalist, anti-state message. Seems to me that what has been alienating people and driving them away from here is not the messages that people have been talking about, but the presence of hundreds of police around the camp who are threatening people with violence. I think that it is possible to have a clear political message and to be those who chart a certain direction without really taking away from the potential for cooperation with other social and political forces. I mean, that kind of thing is what George's book is for, to have a very, very broad appeal. But I think it's also worthwhile for there to be spaces that have very clear radical message, even if it comes at the price of alienating some people here, which I think the police does much better.
Let's say this. I think that for me, camp is about getting large numbers of people together who are prepared to take direct action. That for me is the heart of it. Now, there are, I believe, many more people who would be prepared to do that than are represented at camp. I think that part of the issues with a very strong police presence are because the police look and they say, hang about, this is being organised by the same kind of people who have been organised, say, with the G8 protests, the same people who have been organised by May Day. There's no question that they come in ludicrously heavily on it. But also, it's this oppositional culture, it's this classic thing which happens between a subculture and the police, but they get into their own fight, like the mods and the rockers, kind of fighting it out. I think it would have been much healthier actually for camp if its posturing right from the very beginning had been very different. Does anybody here have a copy of the brochure which comes with the camp? You know, with the main image on it, because that's. I think there's a. Let's have a look at this. You come to Climate Action Camp, right? The front cover here. I'm sorry, this doesn't say to me non-violent direct action. This is an army knife. It's a militaristic symbol, and it has things which, yes, okay, we can see that the tools here are partly peaceful. But we can also see things which are involved with directly dismantling power of state. And here on the back, of course, we got you know. We've got people up tripods and so on. But I mean, this is really the kind of image, it's the front thing that people see. I would have liked this actually to be something which was much more peaceful in its messaging, much more engaging, and that you walk in through a front gate, say, you know, and it has a slogan, you know, sort of capitalism is chaos and so on. Well, I think what I'd like to do is I'd like actually the discussion to happen inside the camp for people to come in, and when they hear different points of view, they hear a very strong anti-capitalist point of view, they maybe hear something which represents more their own point of view, and they can work it out for themselves. And I don't actually think that a protest camp, the only protest camp, this is the only protest camp, the only direct action which happens in this mass way, should necessarily be aligned with any one ideology over and above another. I think the core of it is people who care about climate change wanting to stop something with their bodies. Right? And I think, to be honest, I think there's room within that principle for people from a very wide range of political perspectives.
I think you're being a bit unfair with this analysis. I mean, with this Swiss Army knife, most people, I think, perceive a Swiss Army knife as a tool, not as a weapon. And this is really trying to convey the message that, okay, here is where you come to get tools to deal with climate change, both in your own life, politically, in your community, etc. I think that the minute that you talk about direct action, the minute that you talk about people breaking the law or people not appealing to the usual authorities in order to make change for them, but taking their lives into their own hands and changing things by themselves, this is already an extremely oppositional point of view. I'm not talking about wedding it to any particular ideology or to fine details, but I think that the message that should come from this camp, and is coming from it in not too radical a way, is that you can't use the same kind of thinking and the same kind of institutions that have created a problem in order to solve that problem. And these thinking and institutions being the top-down thinking of the state, the profit-oriented thinking of capitalism.
We're talking about slightly different things for the camp. We're talking about whether the camp is an expression of of a worldview, and I have a lot of agreement with what you're saying.
I think everyone agrees with each other.
Yes,
here,
I mean there's a lot of agreement on that. Or whether it is first and foremost a tool for building a mass and diverse movement which is prepared to take radical action. I think there's an enormous middle ground which isn't getting addressed, which is a middle ground of people who do not have radical oppositional politics but are prepared to step up in terms of the kind of protest action they have. And the thing that worries me is you've got the mainstream organisations who never take anything resembling direct action and never actively confront things. And we know that's not how you get social change. We know you have to take on the path in order to get change. And then you have this smaller group of people who are prepared to take radical action, and they drift further and further and further out. What interests me is that middle ground. Because at the moment that middle ground sticks with the mainstream organisations with their letter writing campaigns. And this has always been the problem, right from 20 years ago we were doing stuff in Britain with Earth First. We had exactly the same discussions. There were some of us who wanted to build a mass oppositional movement which was very diverse, brought in a lot of people and used direct action as a tactic but recognised a range of opinion, and the ones who wanted it to become an extremely inward-looking, almost lifestyle, personal culture statement. I go to Earth First gatherings now, just as I come here, I see very little representation by people of colour, I see very little representation by people who are let's say, not university educated, and we can go further and make class analysis on that as well. And it doesn't look like it's building a diverse movement to me, or even beginning to get there.
Well, the question if that's actually the goal.
Can we just move on and say, what next year for Climate Camp? How is it actually going to expand? Because it's expanded slowly. Each year it gets bigger, but it's not growing a huge movement. It's getting bigger in sort of 500, 1,000, 1,500. How is it going to get beyond that?
Well, there are two questions here. One is, first of all, I think that next year's Climate Camp will probably be facing the same kind of situations and having the same kind of debate that we're having here. But the question is whether really it is the climate camp's role specifically to be building that kind of mass movement that you are envisioning, or whether the climate camp's role is precisely to push the boundaries of accepted political dialogue and to push the boundaries of what is acceptable as political action for the broad public. I mean, if there had not been this very marginalized, very brutalized direct action movement active in all of these countries for all of these years, direct action would never have become an option that everyday people can countenance. And they only countenance this now because of that action. So I think that actually confrontational attitudes, political antagonism, radical agendas do not necessarily close a political space. Sometimes they can open a political space, because by moving further on, you create this kind of pool that more moderate or less radical people can suddenly feel comfortable being where they were not before. And it also enables, at the same time, it enables NGOs and people who want to get concessions from government, etc., to have much more political power to do that, because they can come to the government and say, look, people are crazy out there. You know, they're prepared to shut down coal stations. They're prepared to take all this kind of nonviolent direct action. And if we don't actually respond with some serious measures, we're going to have revolution on our hands.
Okay, so we've got to wrap this up. George, what do you think?
In terms of your question, Hamish, regarding next year, what I would like is, I would like, if there is a next year for Climate Camp, I would like to focus on, again, a very visible, very tangible target, and be prepared to take radical action on it. But I would like it to be working much, much more to be building links and bridges with other progressive social change movements. I'm not talking about, young conservatives for climate action. I'm talking here about recognizing there are huge sections, for example, of a labour movement who I see very poorly represented here. There was a trades union workshop here that had a dozen people in it. That there are progressive social rights, human rights organisations that are very poorly represented within the general climate change movement, who all of these people have a background of direct action. This idea that direct action is something which belongs exclusively to the anarchist left is simply not true. It's a means to an end. It's a form of political expression, and I think it has a much wider ownership. So what I'd like is actually for next year's climate change to be a numbers game. How many people can we get? Can we get 10,000? Can we get 20,000? Because actually in the end, in terms of achieving our objectives, if we want to really have an impressive direct action, in the end it's a numbers game. I mean, you know that as well as I do. If we have 1,000 people, it's very different from having 10,000. You have 10,000, the police can't stop anything.
So,
100,000, you can close down London.
Brief reply before we...
Yeah, I mean, I would find it sad if through a process like the Climate Camp, direct action comes to be capable of being interpreted as a form of demand from governments to change their policies. I think that direct action is a means to an end, but it's also one that has its own political content inside it, that we take responsibility to make change and don't expect those in power to do it for us. What I would think that I'd like to see in next year's Climate Camp is a broadening and clarifying of the other issues that are really at stake here. We're talking not just about climate change, we're talking about energy depletion, we're talking about the global food crisis, we're talking about a number of converging crises of the 21st century that climate just happens to be, because of Al Gore and US signing Kyoto, etc., very prominent at this time. But really, it seems to me that peak energy is going to be as important and financial meltdown as well. So I think that we need to be looking more comprehensively at these things, even if we continue to call it Climate Camp. And I would be happy if we did have a convergence and coalescence around a clearer political line that says that confronting climate change has to have more rather than less equality involved, and also more rather than less freedom involved.
Okay, if you want to learn more about these things, there's 2 books. They're both really interesting. Check them out. And you can get them from the websites down below. So do buy the books and support the authors. Thank you very much from Vision on TV.